Shabbat Shalom. The book of Leviticus seems slightly obsessed with matters of tameh, impurity, and tahor, purity. I do not share that obsession. In fact, I bristle at the very mention of purity. I find the notion of purity problematic, bordering on offensive. It's problematic that purity is associated with the color white. It's problematic that purity has been and continues to be used to punish women and girls, to degrade and dehumanize members of the LGBTQ community. I resent how purity has made its way into political discourse and sometimes even dictates policy. The very concept of purity suggests an impossible ideal, something that is completely clean, unsullied, untouched by any error, any blemish, any doubt or misgiving. Is there anything that exists in this world that is completely untainted? Is there anything that is free of even the tiniest bit of schmutz? By definition, purity lies outside the reach of the human experience. So how is it something that we are supposed to admire, to revere? Why are we supposed to chase something that is, by definition, unachievable? Well, let's not make the mistake of understanding the ancient concept in the Torah of purity according to our contemporary norms. In our secular world and in the world of some other religious traditions, purity is associated with moral judgment, where people stain themselves through supposedly ungodly behavior. But that is not the case in Torah. According to the Torah, purity is not associated with morality, but with mortality. Tameh and tahor, impurity and purity, are temporary states of being, bound up with the intersection of life and death. And often we find ourselves moving between them. This space is not only unavoidable, it is at the core of what it means to be human. When we brush up against death, even the hint or potential of death, our purpose is to respond by embracing life. For example, according to the laws of Torah, we can become impure upon contact with a corpse. And yet the ritual of preparing a body for burial, known as tahorah, is considered one of Judaism's greatest mitzvot. In contrast to American puritanical notions, Judaism teaches us that it is an act of godliness to knowingly and willingly put oneself in this state of tameh, of impurity. In the coming weeks, we will read about other ways that we become tameh. For example, tzara'at, a skin ailment, makes us impure. Its white scales make one look similar to a corpse. It reminds us that one day we will be a corpse. And when a woman gives birth, creating a life that is full of promise while also mortal and certain to eventually die, she is in a state of tameh. She is the vessel, the creator of what will be life and death. According to the Torah, to be in a state of impurity is not wrong or bad or shameful. It can be honorable or desirable, even as it sometimes can be devastating. Again, it's not about morality, but about mortality. When we come close to life's vulnerabilities, that can sometimes be risky and oftentimes frightening. This week's portion contains one of the most shockingly intense moments of death in the Torah. Aaron's two sons, Nadav and Avihu, attempt to draw close to God by making an offering in the temple that has not been proscribed. They are immediately and dramatically consumed by fire and killed. In the verses that follow, God warns Aaron, "Drink no wine or other intoxicant, you or your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die. This is a law for all time throughout the ages. For you must distinguish between the sacred and the profane, between the impure and the pure." Now, this is a rich section. We can spend a great deal of time on this piece of text in understanding this lesson about Tameh and Tahor. Certainly, God makes that connection directly for us. But the tragedy, the horror of Nadav and Avihu's deaths brings us to a depth of emotion that makes this kind of analysis immaterial, if not inappropriate. So I would rather turn toward a moment in this week's text that is far less affecting. In fact, it's a passage that could be easily overlooked. I'm talking about the verses that Rabbi Kahn read for us bravely, because you don't see those words very often, detailing a circumstance that in comparison to the death of Nadav and Avihu seems utterly important. And yet somehow this piece of text creeps its way into the Torah. When a small creature or creepy crawler, like a mouse or a lizard, falls into a ceramic pot and dies, that vessel becomes tameh. It becomes impure. And what do we do in response? We shatter that vessel. We break it. It tells us something about the power of tameh, of impurity. To become tameh as a human being is to be filled with keen awareness, to be electrified with feeling and sensitivity. It means to be vulnerable. Drawing close to God's eternality through our own mortality makes us become attuned to life's preciousness through the reality of its fleetingness, of its ending. And that can be enough to shatter us. That can certainly be enough to make us feel broken. Of course it can. Just in the news alone, we are constantly facing reminders of life's fragility. Another school shooting, terrible violence in the Middle East and in our city, the damage to our environment that taints water and air. And then we have personal reminders, the yahrzeit of someone that we adored, a medical test result that shakes us, even the sight of a crushed bird on the street. And that fragility is all experienced in the wondrous context of the wondrous majesty of our world, evidence of God's eternality. Especially now, during this season of rebirth and blooming, we know that spring will come, and yet we never stop marveling at the cherry blossoms, at the warmth of air after the cold of winter. We know that the next morning the sun will rise, and still the light of day energizes us. We know this from the impactful goodness in our lives, even seemingly small things. The bus driver who waits while we run to the stop. The community that gathers every Shabbat for singing and prayer, no matter what else is happening in the world. Tameh is the truth of deterioration, of temporality. It is the truth of our mortality. Tahor is a reminder of permanence, that which is continual and everlasting. We live in a world that constantly tells the stories of both, and both are the truths of our own existence. The mortality of our bodies and the godliness of our souls. It is impossible to avoid reminders that life is fleeting. So Judaism urges us, instead of trying to deny that reality, instead of attempting to close our eyes and our hearts to our vulnerabilities, to remember the lesson of the broken vessel. Wince at the sharp edges of brokenness in our lives, and then heal them, not to perfection, which would be impossible, but toward wholeness. Repair the brokenness in ourselves and in our worlds and in each other, even though the cracks will always show, even though we will break again. This is how we come into closer contact with godliness, with our impulsive, insistent, continual striving toward life. Tameh, impurity, is not dirty or sinful. And tahor, purity, is not a virtue. They are poles through which we move in our lives, a dance that brings us from wholeness to brokenness and back to wholeness again. Our drawing close to God through the sacred experience of being utterly, painfully, miraculously human. Amen.